Hello again, it's me, Anne Diamond, and welcome to another Thursday here on Viking.TV. Now, this week, we've been gently cruising along the River Elbe in Germany, taking in the sights and the atmosphere of the amazing country and the towns and cities along the route. But what about the tastes? Well, my guest today knows all about the incredible tastes of German baking, but from a pretty unique perspective, because she was born in Berlin, she grew up in America, has an Italian mother, and studied in Paris. It was often the thought of food and blogging about it whilst living in New York that she recognised the comfort that cooking and baking can provide, particularly against homesickness. And that's why she described her first book as a love story. My Berlin Kitchen, it was called. And the book tells her story, but also includes recipes from the three countries that are each a part of her identity. Italian recipes, of course, from her mother, some New York specialities, and of course, German dishes. It's fun because if you follow her recipes, you get to try things with wonderful names that you can spend days just trying to pronounce, like Roseninbrötchen, Rhabarberkuchen, and Zitronenbiskuitrolle. I don't know how I've done, but it was fun trying. My Berlin Kitchen became a Los Angeles Times bestseller. So let's meet the author herself. And though we're on TV, we'll try to get a sense of the tastes that delight and inspire her. And don't forget, whilst we are live right now, do send us your questions and I'll ask them a bit later on. But right now, welcome to Luisa Weiss. Hello there.
Hi, thank you so much.
So are you in Berlin right now?
I am.
Now, as I said, you've lived in New York, but what drew you back to Berlin?
Oh, I suppose that it was just always a feeling that it was home, and that as much as I adored living in New York and I had a wonderful life there, it just never felt quite right. And Berlin is where I was born, and I left at a young age. And I always just wanted to be back here. And so that's how what drew me back was just my soul.
There are probably a lot of people watching right now who've never been there, but always wanted to. How would you seduce them to coming to Berlin? What would you say it's about? What is so magical about it?
It's such a good question, because in fact, Berlin is a pretty complicated place. I mean, it's got a lot of history that's not always wonderful. And it's hard to sort of put your finger on exactly what it is, because it's not like Rome or Paris, where the beauty just is so overwhelming. And Berlin has a grittiness to it and sort of an underside that's a little shadowy. But I like that. I think the complexity of the city is really attractive. And I think that for a lot of people who don't know quite where they belong, Berlin ends up being the place where they feel most at home, because it's a place where you can really just sort of do your thing and be yourself. There are lots of sort of weird individualistic people here, and everybody kind of has the freedom to live on their own terms, or at least they did until recently.
If it has a personality, how would you describe its personality?
A very grumpy, prickly, but funny, like life of the party. So it's a fun place, but it's not always easy, but it's beautiful, but then there's this underside. So yeah, kind of a complicated person, not an easy person to love, but once you get past the exterior, they're your best friend for life, that kind of person.
It's lived, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where are you then within Berlin now? What part of Berlin are you in?
So I live in the district of Wilmersdorf. It's in what was earlier, or what used to be known as West Berlin, and it's sort of a central district. We're quite close to the old, like, Fifth Avenue of Berlin, the way it used to be.
And what's life like in Berlin at the moment? I mean, how have the last couple of years been, and is it opening up in Berlin now? Well,
I mean, I think Germany's gotten a lot of press for having gotten things right at the beginning of the pandemic. And Berlin certainly, I mean, there's very strict mask regulations in effect. You can't take a public transportation without wearing an FFP2 mask, and people take it very seriously. Life feels more normal now than it has in a while. But I think if you're fully vaccinated, life feels even more normal because you're allowed to go to restaurants and you can go to movie theaters. Life is somewhat open, but the pandemic is everywhere. You can sort of feel it. You can't go inside a shop without a mask on, and you have to be fully vaccinated to go inside every kind of shop except for grocery stores. So we've gotten used to it, and so it feels sort of normal now. But yeah, whenever I speak to family in the States, I realize like, oh, it's very different. Things are very different depending on where you are in the United States as well.
Certainly does. What about the markets? I always think of the wonderful markets in Berlin. Have they been open, and are they open now?
They're open now. And they're, well visited. We've got green markets in every district of the city, but flea markets too. I think some of the flea markets are operating on a somewhat more irregular schedule, but the really big ones are all functional.
And what about, again, if we're talking to people who've never been there before, the major places to go and see, you can go and see them now, you can walk around.
Absolutely, everything's open. Berlin never had a strict lockdown as, for example, Spain did. So you've always been able to walk the streets and be outside, and there's no mask ordinance for walking around. So life outside on the street feels pretty normal.
So I said at the beginning that you were born in Berlin and then moved to America, and then you've decided to come back. So how long have you been living in Berlin now as an adult?
Since 2010.
Aha. Has it changed in that last, 10 years or so?
Yes. Berlin is incredible because it's constantly changing. It's the most unstatic. Unstatic. Whatever the word I'm thinking of. It's it's constantly changing. And even in the past 10 years, so much has happened. The thing that I think of the most is the restaurant scene. Restaurants have become much more interesting, much more varied, much more authentic than they were even just 10 years ago. There's been a huge influx of people working in tech to Berlin. So one of the sort of not such nice developments is that rents have really skyrocketed, making it a slightly more difficult place to live. But in terms of tourism, it's a wonderful time to be here because there's so much delicious food to try from all kinds of different cultures, and there's a lot of youth in the city that's really vibrant and that are doing incredibly interesting things. And
so it is more lively now. It is more vibrant than ever before. Last time I saw Berlin was when the wall fell. That was a long time ago.
Wow.
Has Berlin changed since then?
Yes, it has. Yes, it has. But what's so funny about Berlin is that, so I obviously grew up in West Berlin. I was born in West Berlin, and I was a preteen when the wall fell. But so it's a long time ago, but I still remember it so vividly the way it was before. And I live near where I grew up, and there are little corners here and there where sometimes you come around a corner and you see an apartment building that hasn't been refinished or hasn't been recently renovated, and it's suddenly you're like, wait, is it 1985 or is it 2022? Because some corners still feel completely unchanged, but on the whole, it's a very, very vibrant, different city.
Quite an interesting reminder that, though, isn't it? That, things have changed, things have moved on, but there is always a history there.
The history in Berlin is never more than, 3 feet away from you, whether you're walking down the street and tripping over one of the stumbling block memorials for Jews killed in the war, in the Holocaust, or finding memorials to, any number of people. The city's full of historical reminders everywhere.
Yeah. I don't know whether you'd know this, actually, because obviously you're not old enough to, I suppose, have experienced it, especially once you were interested in food and cooking and baking. But when Berlin was reunified, with the sudden influx of people from East Germany, did the culinary world change? Did they bring in different styles of cooking and baking, or Or was it all the same, really? I don't know. What do you think?
So the German baking, East or West, there's a shared heritage there. And there are obviously regional specialties from the Eastern states that are specialties from there, but they're quite well known. I mean, in a sense, no, the food didn't change so much in that direction. I would say more that when Germany became unified, it took a while, but now, for example, I have a recipe for it in my baking book, something called Franzbrötchen. They're a specialty from Hamburg. They're these sort of squashed croissant looking pastries that are flavored with cinnamon. Yeah. Those come from Hamburg. And when I was a child in Berlin, you'd never heard of them. I'd never heard of them. Nobody had. But if you came from Hamburg, that was a Hamburg treat. Now, Franzbrötchen are available in bakeries everywhere. Everybody knows what they are. So I would say more that before things were much more siloed, and now, if anything, the West's influence have gone east.
Yes. Well, we'll talk about that, certainly, particularly I suppose, it's interesting as well, the influence of America on German baking, because obviously the reason that Americans are so keen on German type baking is because Germans went out to America and took their baking with them. But then the Americans have changed things. But we'll talk more about that later if we can. Yes. We were talking about Berlin itself, and I thought maybe let's have a brief glimpse of the sort of sights that Berlin has to offer to anyone cruising through. So here is Viking's Karina Hagen to give us a glimpse.
Berlin. It's been said that this vibrant city is always becoming, but will never be, because it's always reinventing itself.
If you only have half a day in Berlin, there are a few things you really should experience.
Iconic Brandenburg Gate is definitely one of them. Equally impressive is the Berlin Wall, a ribbon of concrete that divided the city and became the focal point of the Cold War. Its scale must be seen to be believed. The Reichstag Parliament is a landmark you really shouldn't miss. Entirely rebuilt, its crowning dome, designed by Sir Norman Foster, is an architectural masterpiece.
And another must-see is Museum Island, a World Heritage Site. It's a wonderful place to stroll around by foot.
In all, there are 5 fascinating museums. If you have more time, Berlin's Jewish Museum is definitely worth a look. Designed by Daniel Liebeskind, the museum is internationally known for its dramatic architecture and thought-provoking exhibits. A tour of the now-closed Tempelhof Airport is unforgettable. In 1948, it was a lifeline, providing food and supplies to West Berliners after the Soviet blockade.
So there you are, a glimpse of just a few things that Berlin can offer. So Luisa, when you left Berlin the first time, when your family moved to America, how old were you?
I was a little over 2.
Oh, right. So you were very little. I was going to say, did America feel very different?
Well, I don't remember that much then, but my father's American and my mother's Italian. So I grew up, even at that young age, I was already speaking those 3 languages and very much at home in the 3 cultures. But my father and I moved to Boston. My mother actually stayed here, so my parents divorced. So moving to Boston was a sort of strange thing. It wasn't always that easy, but it was normal. I mean, that was life at the time.
But you describe in your book that you sort of felt a bit confused about your identity, especially when you were younger. Luckily, you were multilingual, as you say. But is that when you turned to thinking about food being a comfort and helping you with a sense of homesickness?
I think it took me a while to figure that out. When I was really little, I liked, eating, and I had a very, very dear family friend who was like a nanny who taught me how to bake in Berlin. It wasn't really until I was in college or maybe even graduate school, which is when I lived in Paris. And that was my first, homesickness was sort of the leitmotif of my life. But in Paris, I really felt it and I could do something about it. That's when I discovered that cooking was sort of a comfort. And then in New York, it sort of kicked into high gear.
It's sort of understandable, I suppose, isn't it? Taste and smell, I think, is so very evocative. And if you can create that by what you're cooking, it does make you feel, well, as though you're at home, I guess. What did you study in Paris?
I actually went there to study French, to get my master's in French cultural studies, but it didn't quite work out. I ended up working at a publishing company instead, which is fine because that's what I really wanted to do, was to work in book publishing. So I went to get my master's and I left employed by.
And I think that you landed then, you thought a job that you almost had to pinch yourself because it was just so brilliant. You were reading manuscripts all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in Paris, I started out reading the slush pile manuscripts for the publishing company, and that was great. And then in New York, I became a literary scout. And there, really, my entire job was reading manuscripts, writing readers' reports, telling my clients, which were international publishers, which books they should buy to publish in their countries. It was a dream job. I'll never have such a good job again.
You must be a quick reader. I know you were always a passionate reader, even as a child.
Yes, I'm a very fast reader. Yep. That's just, yeah.
But reading all those other people's manuscripts, is that when you sort of started thinking, I should be writing myself?
I always loved to write. I loved to write even in grade school, and I studied writing in college. But my writing professor at the time, when I was thinking about graduate school, said, don't get an MFA. Don't go to graduate school to learn how to write. You don't need to do that. You just need to go live your life and write. If you need to write, you will write. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I guess I'll follow his advice because I trust him.
I think all good writers say that as advice, don't they? They say just get off your backside and write. That's the best thing you can possibly do. So is that when you started a blog?
Yeah. So 2003, 2004, I discovered food blogs, and I thought, oh, I loved reading them. I loved reading food blogs. And at some point in 2005, I thought, why, if I love reading them so much and I like to write and I like to cook, why don't I start a food blog? And so I did. And I was convinced I was the last person on the planet to start a food blog, which is, of course, absurd because it was 2005 and there were like 20 of them. But I started mine and I started writing on a weekly basis. I was blogging, 3-4 times a week. And within a couple of years, I thought back to the thing that my professor had told me. And I realized that I was doing exactly what he had told me to do, which was that if I needed to write, it would just come out of me. And it took me years to figure out that that's what was happening.
It's a discipline, I suppose, isn't it? Making yourself sit down and write about something. Did you always cook something first and then write about that, or was it just general?
No, it was always home cooking. Like I would use the recipes as a jumping off point to write about whatever.
Yeah. And that blog grew and grew and grew, and it's still going, I gather.
It is. I mean, it's taken a few long pauses here and there when I had children. I had 2 boys, and when I was writing the books. And so it's not really as updated anymore because time has moved on. I write a newsletter now, and I'm focused on, I'm writing a new book, actually, a new cookbook. And so the blog it's still there though. There's so many recipes there, and a lot of people that still go there to look for recipes and visit it.
How do you find, you say you've written 2 books already. We're just about to talk about classic German baking, but that's 2 books already with recipes in them, and you're writing a 3rd. Where do all the recipes come from? Or do you make them up, or what?
No, so my Berlin kitchen was a super personal memoir, and the recipes are all from my family, from my husband's family, from my Italian family. So those are family recipes. My Berlin classic German baking, there I was really trying to adapt and translate this whole body of German baking culture for an American and English audience. And so I found the recipes everywhere, old cookbooks, websites, family friends, family recipes from the person down the street, the back of the almond paste package at the grocery store. I looked for recipes everywhere, and I really tried to just like deliver the most authentic collection of traditional German recipes, but tested for American and UK bakers so that they could recreate them in their homes.
Yeah, and I know you deliberately went for some of the lesser known German dishes, like, I've got them written down, Holländer Blütensirup, which is...
That is in my Berlin kitchen, and that's elderflower syrup. The recipe's from my close family friend. Yeah.
And Zwetschgen.
Zwetschgen.
That's Italian plums.
Exactly, Zwetschgen. That's the German. Well, they're called in America. They're called Italian prune plums. Here, they're just called Zwetschgen, and they're those sort of oval, dark purple plums that come at the very end of summer. They're very good for baking.
They sound better in German. And the one that sounds absolutely brilliant in German is Pfifferlingen.
Yes.
Which are
chanterelle mushrooms. It's one of the best words ever. Pfifferling. Yeah.
It's the most beautiful word, Pfifferlingen. And I know you use white asparagus, for instance. You talk about Kaffee und Kuchen, coffee and cake, and that's not just something to eat and drink. It's actually a sort of German thing, isn't it? It's a tradition. It's something that Germans like to do mid-afternoon.
Yes, it's like the fourth meal. It's the third meal of the day, so to speak. So Germans will have breakfast, lunch, which is always a hot meal, a cooked meal, then Kaffeezeit in the afternoon, which is a coffee with a cake or a snack or whatever, and then dinner, which is usually just cold sandwiches, quite light. Yep. And so that afternoon meal, it has traditionally been a pretty substantial one. I think it came out of Germany was an agrarian society. People were working long hours, burning a lot of calories, and they needed to have sustenance in the afternoon. And so German cakes, torts and things like that are quite rich and sweet, but a lot of the sort of homier German baked goods aren't that sweet. They're I wouldn't say nutritious, because it's not like they're, a granola bar, but they, whatever. But they're quite sort of bready, sweet breads with lots of fruit, nuts, streusel. They're quite satisfying snacks.
So it's about taking a break. It's about having a bit of a breather with a coffee and something a little bit substantial, nice and probably sweet to keep you going, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's some relationship to the British tea time, but I would say it's a little heartier.
Yes, a bit more substantial.
Yeah.
It's interesting as well in the German baking book. You clearly know that writing about German baking for a wider audience, for a wider global audience, you're also a bit of an ambassador for Germany, aren't you? You're actually saying there's maybe more to Germany than just what you think, because as you said, it's not exactly got a cuddly image.
No, I think, this is something I think about all the time, and I think it's a really complicated issue. I love Germany, and I think it's a wonderful place to be, but it has a lot of difficulties, and there's a lot of complicated stuff about Germany, and that if you love it, you have to also really be aware of all of its history and also its present day problems. But I think that German food culture or German cake culture is so special, and it's not necessarily that well known outside of Central Europe. And there's something really loving and generous about it. When babies are born or at funerals, traditionally Germans bring these beautiful baked wreaths that they make themselves. All the Germans I know bake their own Christmas cookies. Nobody's buying them. Baking is such a part of daily life and of the fabric of life here. I really wanted to transmit that, because I think it's an aspect of German culture that just isn't as well known, and it's really sweet, like in more ways than one.
Yeah, so actually you are being an ambassador to a certain extent. For Viking guests, for instance, visiting Berlin, what would be your recommendations for where to go and have the Kaffee and cooking in the afternoon. Where would they find the best bakeries? Is there a particular area, or are they all over?
They're all over. They're all over. The bakery the place that I think is really the absolute best and that people should go to, just because it not only are the cakes out of this world, but it's like frozen in time, is a cafe called Café Buchwald, Buchwald. It's in the district of Moabit along the canal. And this cafe has been baking torts and cakes since the 19th century. And the tea room looks like something from the 1950s. It's completely untouched. And they not only make incredibly beautiful, delicious torts, an enormous variety of them, but they also make something called Baumkuchen, which is called tree cake, which is tree cake in English. And it's a cake that's baked on a spit, on a rotating spit. The batter is painted on in layers. And the cake sort of grows as it bakes in width, like a tree trunk, and then it gets coated in chocolate. And it's absolutely wonderful. It's a specialty of Berlin. I mean, this kind of Baumkuchen, and they do an incredible mail order business all over the world. The Japanese love them, but also immigrants from Berlin that left and moved to the United States or wherever, they still order their Baumkuchen from this cafe. So that's my number one.
That's Baumkuchen.
Baumkuchen, yeah. And there's a recipe for it in my book as well, in Classic German Baking. But if you can come to Berlin, I think it'll be even better.
Good to look out for. Well, I did ask before we came on air for your 5 top German bakes, really, or foods that everybody should try and taste if they visited Berlin. So I think we've got pictures of each. Would you talk us through them?
All right, so this is Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, also known as Black Forest cake. This obviously does not come from Berlin. It comes from the Black Forest.
Yeah.
And it's iconic. I mean, it's a really wonderful, special tort. Very light, thin chocolate sponge, dribbled with Kirsch, cherry schnapps, and then cherries and whipped cream and chocolate shavings. And it's very retro, but it's delicious.
It is retro, isn't it? Yeah. It's been around for years. How do we say it in German again? Schwarzwälder
Kirschtorte.
Kirschtorten. Right. Okay. Well, that's a mouthful in both ways. Okay. Let's go to the next picture of your next top tip.
Right. So these are Elisenlebkuchen. They come from Nuremberg in Bavaria. These are really some of the most iconic gingerbread cookies, I think, that exist. They are made from a very rich nut-based batter. They have hardly any. My recipe has no flour. It's just ground nuts, marzipan, eggs, sugar, and spices. And they're quite substantial. They come usually in a discs about this big, and you have to like share them with people because they're so satisfying.
Very sweet.
They're sweet. They come in a sugar glaze or a chocolate. I personally think the chocolate glaze is better, but and those are exported all over the world, but there's nothing like the real thing. Although the recipe in Classic German Baking is very good.
Absolutely, of course.
Very good.
So that's Elisenlebkuchen.
Elisenlebkuchen. And the funny fact is, they found recipes for Elisenlebkuchen going back something like 800 years. They're incredibly old, and they're still being made more or less the same way.
Oh, wow. Oh, it's lovely history to it. Okay, next one is, so we've got to watch out for that, but this is?
Is this Streuselkuchen? Yes, this is Streuselkuchen. So Streuselkuchen really is nothing more than a sweet yeasted cake covered in buttery, crispy, sweet streusel. And it sounds really plain, but it is, when it's made with delicious butter and it's freshly baked, it's one of the most satisfying cakes that you could find. And in German bakeries, this is like the standard, there's always a whole bunch of cakes available in German bakeries, and Streuselkuchen is almost always one of them.
Right. Okay. That's Streuselkuchen. Streuselkuchen.
Yeah.
Most of them end in Kuchen, which helps.
Yeah.
Okay, next one.
Oh, of course, the pretzel. So in German, this is called a Laugenbrezel or just Brezel, but Lauge is German for lye. The pretzels are dipped in lye before they're baked. And these are specialties from, well, there's the Bavarian pretzel and the Swabian pretzel. And they, in the meantime, obviously are available all over Germany. And they've, of course, been exported to the United States.
Yeah.
And but those are one of Germany's most famous bakes, I would say.
Absolutely. As you say, I mean, you can just look at them and see the history of how they obviously went across the Atlantic to America and taken on a life all of their own. And I think we should have one more, I think, of your top tips. Now, this is what we were talking about earlier, which is the sort of croissant that's
been squashed. So you make the same kind of laminated dough that you would make for a croissant, except that you sprinkle it with a copious amount of cinnamon and sugar, and then you roll them up, you do all the cutting, turn them into croissant, and then you kind of squash them with a cooking spoon and the flat hand. And they're flaky, but they're also chewy because they've been squashed. They're really delicious, and they're really warmly spiced and cozy. This is like a typical afternoon snack that kids would get when they come home from school.
They look lovely. They're in your book as well, and that was we went through your book. We thought we'll make those first.
Yeah,
because they look absolutely and very cinnamony.
And excuse me,
are they heaped with cinnamon? Those?
Yes, very cinnamon. That's their main flavor is cinnamon. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. You see, that's what it makes the house smell so wonderful when you bake like this, doesn't it?
Yes, it really does.
It makes the house welcoming, and it certainly makes it, a cake shop or a restaurant welcoming when you walk in and you can smell that. So, apart from bakes in the book, do you also look at the other sorts of German food, things that well, they're not just cakes or bakes; they're actually, more meals?
Well, that's the book that I'm working on now. The follow-up to the Classic German Baking is going to be Classic German Cooking. So I'll be dealing with everything from soup to stew to roasts to salads. That's all coming up. But in Classic German Baking, I included more than a couple, but I included some savory recipes. So like cabbage strudel or cheese rolls, so that it wasn't just sweet stuff. There is some savory stuff, but all the other recipes are coming.
I saw some sausages, I think, German white sausages, which my kids were salivating at just the look of them. They love German sausages, bratwurst, sauerkraut, as you say, and a healthy beer with it. Yeah, but also the Lebkuchen that we've been talking about.
Well, a fun fact about those white sausages is that those are Bavarian white sausages, and they are served always with a beer and a pretzel, and you're not allowed to eat them after 11 o'clock in Bavaria, which is where they're from. So if you are lucky enough to make a trip to Bavaria, you should have that for breakfast.
You're not allowed to eat them after 11 o'clock in the morning?
No. I mean, you're not supposed to, because they're considered, I think originally it was because they weren't fresh anymore, but now it's sort of part of the tradition that you eat them as like a hearty second breakfast.
Why are they white?
They're made with, I think, a mixture of veal and pork, I think, and they don't have the nitrite that would make sausages pink. I mean, don't quote me on that, but I think that's why.
We'll find out.
Yeah,
it's fascinating. Again, it's part of the culture. It's part of tradition, which makes it fascinating. Gingerbread, of course, huge. I love gingerbread. It's one of the few things I can make, or at least we have a tradition of making in our house. And gingerbread is still huge everywhere you go in Germany, I presume.
Yes, every region has their own style of gingerbread. It's a very diverse category, let's say, of bakes. There's sort of chewy gingerbread over here and crisp gingerbread over there, and gingerbread made with honey there, and bready gingerbread here. Every city, every town has their own way of making it.
Yeah, so there isn't any one particular way. I've always wondered that, because I like chewy gingerbread. Other people like it to snap, but there's no nothing's wrong or right on gingerbread.
No, I think that the really crisp gingerbread that's really thin and sort of snappy, those usually are recipes that come from Scandinavia, so Sweden or Norway or stuff like that. In Germany, because gingerbread largely is made with honey as a sweetener, they tend to be chewier. But there's a wide variation.
But isn't that the fun thing about writing about food, I imagine? It's very dynamic, isn't it? It's always going to change.
It's so fascinating. And I feel like it's just, especially when you're delving into a country's food, there's so much history. There's so much culture that's going on that when you're sort of, at first you think, well, that's just a recipe for, cookies. And then the more you figure out, you're like, oh no, this is actually the entire history of the country is embedded in here somewhere.
So when you came back from America, even though you felt drawn back to Germany, were there any American foods that you missed?
Yes, I would say that living in New York, I was incredibly spoiled because in New York, you can get any kind of food you want, really, whether you feel like something really fancy or really low key. In New York, everything is at your fingertips. And coming back to Berlin in 2010, that wasn't the case. And so the first couple of years, I think that was what I found the hardest. There's also, now it's changing, but there's no takeout culture. So you either cook dinner or you make dinner, or you go out for dinner, but you don't really order. I mean, that's changing now. Now there are more places delivering. But the idea of, ordering Chinese food for dinner, that I missed that a lot when I first moved back.
That's interesting. So, I mean, it's huge in Britain now, the idea of just being able to dial up and having food delivered of any sort at all. But that's not so common in Germany.
Now it's getting to be more common, but it's really a development of the past maybe 4 or 5 years. But I remember I moved back here, and then I think in 2011, I went to visit my best friend who was living in London at the time, and we ordered Indian food from the Indian restaurant down the street. And I was like, this is the most amazing meal I've had in a year and a half.
Why? I mean, we in Britain, even when I went to the trouble of getting some German as I could find, Küchen around me. But the minute I start to do it here, it starts to look Christmassy. And that made me think that here in Britain, we tend to only think of German baking, Stollen and Lebkuchen and stuff, around Christmas time. Why is that? Why is German cooking so bonded to Christmas time?
Christmas is the biggest event, I would say, in German culture. Christmas, I mean, the modern Christmas as we know it is German Christmas, right? The Christmas tree, the ornaments, the songs, all of that comes from Germany, basically in the 19th century. And so I think that that's why, and I see it in people's interest in my book around Christmas time, like clockwork every year. People are like, oh my gosh, this book, there's a Christmas chapter, but there's a whole bunch of other recipes that don't get nearly as much attention. But I think it's because the Germans just have this tradition of baking for Christmas, and they're quite loyal to the cookies that they make only for Christmas. Like you would never, ever eat gingerbread outside past the 25th of December, ever. Oh, no. And you wouldn't bake gingerbread in April. Like it just isn't done. You would only ever, or Stollen, or any of the other sort of warm Christmassy flavored things. Those are kept to December for the Advent time when people are baking.
But huge in December.
Yes, huge.
Massive.
Yes.
I mean, you think of the Christmas markets, which I went to many years ago, and I know so many people, particularly on Viking, will look forward to seeing Christmas markets again. I mean, they're such an enormous, big deal, aren't they?
Yes, and sadly, they've been a casualty of the pandemic the past couple of years. It's just been too difficult to keep the markets open safely because they're so, it's difficult to make them not crowded. I think that in this past December, they were able to keep them open with pretty strict restrictions on how many people were allowed in it at a given time. Maybe next year or 2022, it'll be easier.
Yes, hopefully it will. I mean, we can see just from that picture there the outdoor culture, the culture of being able to sit out and look at the river and everything around you and eat and drink. And it's particularly brilliant at Christmas, but of course it's there all year. I know that during the pandemic, one thing that did happen is that everybody started to do more home baking than ever before. Did you notice that from your blog or from the people who write to you, that people were having a go at things they would never have tried before?
Absolutely. Absolutely. People got much more adventurous. They were stuck at home. I mean, I think the cliche is that everybody started baking sourdough. And I think that's absolutely true. A lot of people, I did too.
Yeah.
I did a regular sourdough in 2020 and a gluten-free sourdough in 2021. But yeah, no, I noticed that there were far more bakers and also just far more people willing to be adventurous, trying recipes that they said, oh, I would have been too intimidated to try this before, but now I have to keep my kids busy, so I'm making strudel with them or whatever.
And actually, I mean, although obviously the pandemic has had a terrible, terrible toll on so many lives, however, from that point of view, it did get people back to some basics, I suppose, back to the kitchen, back to cooking for the family. And a lot of people loved it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a tricky thing to balance, obviously, especially if you have, small children and working from home and being responsible for their constant nutrition. But yeah, I think that for a lot of people, especially when life started to go back to normal a little bit, people realized like, oh, all that togetherness and feeding each other constantly, there was, as oppressive as some people felt it was, in retrospect, it also meant there was a lot of family time.
Yeah, there was some good to it. Did you do that yourself with your children?
Yes. Yeah. My kids were home. I don't know. I think we were basically stuck indoors together, even though we didn't, like I said, we didn't really have a proper lockdown, but schools and daycares were closed for 5 months, I think, where we were. And my husband doesn't cook, so I'm the sole cooker in the family. And it was, I tried to have fun with it. I filmed myself on Instagram cooking to get other people sort of motivated to cook for their families. And it ended up being a nice thing.
We were talking about the fact that you were multilingual earlier. Are your children, do you deliberately try and get them to speak English and German and anything else?
Yeah, I mean, it's deliberate. It is deliberate, but it's also just normal. So I only speak English with them. My husband's German. He speaks German with them, and they're obviously their German grandmother and school and everything. And then my mother, who lives around the corner, is Italian, and she speaks Italian with me and with them. And it's our sort of secret language. So it's not really secret, but if we're out and I have to say, hey, stop that, say it in Italian. But yeah, no, they're trilingual. Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's such a gift. What a gift. Absolutely brilliant. Take us through a few recipes I picked out of your book. I think the first one is Hessian potato cake.
Yes.
With caraway and bacon. That's German?
Yes. So it comes from Hessen, which is a state in West Germany. The state, Frankfurt, is the most famous town in Hessen. And this recipe was such an amazing discovery. So you make a yeasted base, kind of like a thin bread dough, like a pizza crust, sort of. And then you make this filling, which is basically the most deliciously flavored mashed potato filling, flavored with caraway and bacon. And you bake it, and then you can cut it into these gorgeous, sturdy little slabs. And it's an amazing meal with a light salad on the side. It's really satisfying. It's great for like a crowd if you have a big group of people coming and you need to cook for them.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
We've got some German cookies, I think, which I suppose we should all have a go at if we get your... Oh, you see, those are classic, aren't they?
Those are iconic Christmas cookies. They're called Zimtsterne, which means cinnamon stars. And Germans are obsessed with these cookies. If you poll Germans, like, what's your favorite Christmas cookie? Almost all of them will mention this one. They're a thin, not too thin. They're a nut base. There's no flour in them, flavored with cinnamon, and then topped with a meringue. And they're just dried out in the oven, so they're sort of chewy and crisp and really wonderful.
And you can buy them in bags, can't you?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you should always get twice as many as you need, because you can eat them, but you can also hang them up.
Yeah.
And then rooms smell fantastic at Christmas time.
Yes.
I think we've got some Elisenlebkuchen, which we talked about before as well, which you've got a recipe for. Is that, are they them?
That's them. Those are little mini ones. You can make them any size you like. Those are bite-sized ones. And then the traditional ones that you see usually in stores that come in those beautiful decorative tins are larger. They're like a saucer, like a coffee saucer. And like I said, these are a really rich dough made with ground nuts and lots of eggs, sugar, and a lot of almond paste, and then the classic Christmas spices. And they're baked on a wafer, a thin baking wafer. And then you can either glaze them with a sugar glaze or with a chocolate glaze. And they keep really well. They're quite sturdy. They're great for shipping if you want to bake for family that's far away. These are a great option.
They're lovely. Black Forest cake or Schwarzwald Torten. Better say it for me. Schwarzwald something.
Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Black Forest Gâteau, which everybody should have a go at, I guess. Is that very difficult to make?
No, absolutely not. It's just about assembling it, really. The cake itself is quite simple, and then you have to cut it into layers. And then all you do is whip cream and sort of drizzle it with this schnapps, and then layer the whipped cream and the cherries. The most important thing when you're making it is to make it in advance. It needs a little time to rest so that the flavors sort of meld and the sponge of the cake absorbs the alcohol. It's quite boozy. Don't make that. Don't make that for children.
No, very boozy, and
yeah.
So it should be.
My friend who helped me with the recipe testing, her in-laws are from the region where the Black Forest cake is from, and she said that they told her that if you're not drunk after a piece, you haven't used enough schnapps. I haven't tested that. That never happened to me, but anyway.
Oh, well, she's tasting it for you.
Yeah.
And then just a final one, I thought, your pretzels. But these pretzels look as though they've got something in them.
Yeah, they're sort of puffy and cute, aren't they? Yeah, the recipe in my book is wonderful. The most important thing to remember about pretzels, if you want to make them sort of as authentic as possible, is you have to use lye, which you can buy online, and that you have to handle with care. You have to use gloves, and don't make them with very small children around, because lye is caustic and can cause burns if it touches your skin. But if you get over that slight hurdle, lye is what gives the pretzels not only that gorgeous brown color, you wouldn't get that just baking them in the oven, but it gives that iconic pretzel flavor that has sort of, it's almost like a slightly metallic burnt flavor. That's the lye. Yeah.
Right. One of the most difficult delicacies to make, because I've seen it in what we call the Great British Bake Off, which is in America, I think, just called the
TBBO.
Yeah, something like that. Is the Sachertorte.
Yes.
And is this one that's incredibly layered and very difficult to make?
Sachertorte is usually just split in the middle or not split at all. They're alternating views on whether to split it or not, but it's basically one very light chocolate cake that's either been split and filled with apricot jam or left whole and covered in apricot jam, and then with a very thin chocolate glaze on top. And it comes obviously from Vienna. It's actually an Austrian torte, but it is beloved everywhere in the German-speaking world. And I have a recipe in my book, and I love it. It's one of my favorite recipes. I'm actually teaching a class on it online on Saturday. If you would like to know more about that, you can follow me on Instagram.
How do we get to you online on Saturday?
I'm teaching the class with a cooking school called 177 Milk Street.
177 Milk Street.
Yeah. And so if you go to I guess the easiest thing is to just go to my Instagram, which is Wednesday Chef, my handle, and there's information about tickets there. And
you're doing a class in how to cook
how to make Sachertorte, because Sachertorte, the thing that's kind of difficult about it is the glaze, to get that really gorgeous, shiny, mirrored glaze. It can be a little tricky. So I'm going to demonstrate, and to make it a little easier. If you see someone doing it, it can often be easier to make it yourself.
Oh, well, that's interesting because we've got a little bit of video here of Karina Hagen from Viking actually finding where to go to taste the very best Sachertorte. She made this little video. Let's have a little look at the clip.
Hotel Sacher feels like a living museum, a fascinating time capsule of country and culture, where every wall speaks volumes about the intriguing past that unfolded here. Even in the cafe, which also happens to be the perfect spot to experience history with your taste buds. The Sachertorte, with its secret recipe that's still made almost entirely by hand. Hotel Sacher is a rare treasure and a reminder of the many wonders just waiting to be explored in Vienna.
There you go. That's that. But we've got so many questions coming in, Louisa. Can we go straight to them? Don, I'm not sure where you are, Don, but he says, thank you for such an interesting and fun presentation. I'm originally from New York, and I think the thing I miss the most is the food. The only question I have is if you could repeat the name and spelling of the bakery with the tree cake and the chocolate, he says.
Yes, it's called Kaffeezeit, and that's Buchwald, and they have a website. You can order their Baumkuchen. They'll send them to New York. There are Berliners in New York who order from there every year. And if you come to Berlin, you have to go there.
Oh, that's wonderful. Christelle in Minden in the US says, I got to enjoy the Berlin Christmas market early December 2021, showing our vaccination cards. It was wonderful. And then she goes on to say, I lived as a kid in Mainz and Augsburg for 2 years and never saw a pizzeria anywhere in Germany. And then when I visited a few years ago, there were pizzerias everywhere. I was surprised.
Yep.
That's American culture more than Italian, I suppose, taking over, is it?
Well, no, I think Italians definitely imported their pizzerias to Germany, but it's possible that Italians went to different regions. So there were a lot of Italian guest workers in for example, around Wolfsburg, which is where the Volkswagen company is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so Berlin has a lot of pizzerias and has for a long time, but I could imagine that in southwestern Germany, that wasn't necessarily the case until later, depending on when this woman lived there.
Well, exactly. It was in the 60s she lived there.
Oh, yeah. No, that would have been too soon. I think that most of the Italians came after that.
Mika, Mika from Montclair. We know Mika very well. Hello, Mika. She's one of our best viewers. She says, I should try to make a Weihnachtsstollen, which you would eat after midnight mass. Bake with yeast and candied fruit out of a glass container, and then you eat it like bread with butter only. Yum, yum.
Yep.
Does that ring a bell with you?
Yep, that's Stollen. That's how friends of ours eat it, with a thick layer of butter on top. I actually found it very difficult to find a recipe that you could make at home that made really, really good results. So I have something called a Christbrot in classic German baking, which is sort of like a Stollen, but not quite.
All right. Oh, thank you, Mika. Kathleen in Corvallis in the US says, which was the last of the 5 bakes called in German? Are there recipes for bread in your classic German baking book? What very dark breads are featured?
Oh, so no, none of the classic German breads that are sort of quite sour and dark with rye. I don't have any of those in the book because that would have required so much additional work and testing and research that I decided I would leave that for someone else to write a bread baking book. What I did,
there's always more to write about, isn't
exactly. It? What I did include is a chapter on rolls. So breakfast rolls, rye rolls, Rosinenbrötchen. So there's a bunch of different little rolls, but none of the really iconic breads.
Margaret from Rincon in Puerto Rico. Hi, Margaret. Says, is Pfeffernuss German?
Yes, it is. Pfeffernusse are German. Yep.
Very famous, isn't it?
Very famous. There's a recipe for them in classic German baking too. That is actually the recipe that took us the most tries to get right. I think we tested that recipe more than 10 times until we got one we were happy with.
That must have been nice, testing so much. Diana in Cambridge in the United Kingdom says, this conversation is really making me hungry. Thank you to Louisa for sharing these great tips. I'm making notes for my next trip to Berlin. Oh, that's lovely. Christelle says, Louisa, do today's German eaters still like Gurkensalat, Kartoffelsalat, and Schwetzenküchen, all recipes that my mom passed down to me?
Gurkensalat and Kartoffelsalat, absolutely. I didn't catch the last one.
Schwetzenküchen.
Schwetzenkuchen. I don't know what that is. I'm going to write that down because I'll need to investigate for my next book.
Schwetzen, I'm sure I've said it right, Schwetzenküchen, which are recipes that her mum passed down. So
That's
Estelle, but you've come up with one that Louisa's got to look into now. Carol and Bill from the Steppe in the US says, we were lucky enough to be in Berlin before and during after the wall went down. At the time, Berliners lived every day to the fullest, not knowing what tomorrow would bring. Is Kurfürstendamm still the best place for restaurants? Strasse, I think, still the best Strasse for restaurants. Also, is the Racy Club still there with its booths and telephones?
I think
what's your favourite place to eat now?
Well, the Kurfürstendamm, I think that's what she was talking about, is still, it's a very important sort of shopping boulevard. It's very big and lots of stores and stuff. There are some restaurants, though I wouldn't say that it's the place to go for restaurants anymore. And the club or the bar that she's talking about with the booths and telephones, I don't think it exists anymore. I think I saw it in a movie, though, in an old movie that I watched recently. No, now Berlin has become an incredible place for restaurants, and they're all over. Every neighborhood has something to offer. It's really special. It's really exciting.
That's why you need a bit of time to walk around, don't you, and explore.
Yeah.
Leonardo in San Francisco, we're going all around the world here. Is there a German dessert similar to a cream puff? And what kind of filling besides cream, chocolate or fruits and jams and jellies?
So yeah, the cream puff in German is called Windbeutel, which basically means wind bag. And they're large. They're usually made about the size of a dessert plate, and they're filled with whipped cream and usually served with some kind of red fruit like cherries or strawberries or raspberries. That's the classic.
Sounds great. Christelle's been on again. She says, my mom was born in Ostpreußen, East Prussia, specifically Königsberg, then now Kaliningrad, Russia. I'm American because my parents immigrated in 1952. She was an excellent baker, and I still remember her Krapfen, that's sugared round donuts with a little jam in the middle. Yes. I wonder if this is more German or Russian or Polish recipe.
No, East Prussia is now Poland, and there's obviously a lot of overlap in terms of food, but Krapfen are jelly donuts, and in Berlin they're called Pfannkuchen. In the rest of Germany they have lots of different names, including Berliner, because they were originally, I think, created by a chef working for the Prussian army in Berlin in the 19th century or maybe 18th century. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, but East Prussians were known for their baked goods. They were very talented bakers, and there's a lot of really delicious food in old East Prussian cookbooks that I've found.
And isn't it important that these are written down and kept, because it's part of the cultural history apart from anything else? Yeah. Here we go. Right, Leonardo is back on from San Francisco. He says, he's coming to Berlin. I have never tried German food before. What foods should I try when I'm there? Is the food heavy with meat?
So yes and no. I mean, I think that German food, if you go to a classic German restaurant, you will, of course, be presented with a lot of meat. But you don't have to that's not necessarily a must anymore. And there's so many interesting restaurants, also German, sort of modern German cooking, that are much more vegetable and fish focused. So it really kind of depends. If you're looking for really traditional restaurants, you will end up eating more meat, but you don't have to. You can avoid them, or you can do a mix of modern German and traditional German. And also, if you're coming to Berlin, Berlin is such an international city. The numbers of people, Berliners who were born somewhere else or who have heritage from another country, is huge. And so there's an amazing assortment of different cuisines to choose from.
We've got lots of people coming in again on the Quetschenkuchen. Hannah in Philadelphia says Quetschenkuchen is a torte or a cake made with those Italian prune plums. My mum made that each end of the summer, and I do too. Guten Appetit.
Yes.
And then that's joined again by Christel in Minden, who says the Zwetschgenkuchen, if I'm saying it correctly, was plum cake, the type of Italian plums that Luisa mentioned.
Yep.
Don't people love to talk about cookery? My goodness. Margaret's on again from Puerto Rico and says, do you have a recipe for rote Grütze?
I do. Rote Grütze. So it's one of my favorite desserts in the whole world. It's a fruit pudding. It's hard to describe. Fruit pudding doesn't sound that appetizing, but it's a red fruit pudding gelled with cornstarch, and you eat it with vanilla sauce with like a creme anglaise. And it's cold. You eat it in the summer months, and it's out of this world. I have a recipe for it in my Berlin kitchen.
In the Berlin kitchen, good. And if anyone wants to know how to buy Luisa's books, there's a button on this page on our Viking TV page. So we've still got a few more, if I wouldn't mind. I don't want to keep you too long.
No, it's such a pleasure. I'll answer all night.
Isn't it fun when you're actually answering people's questions directly because they want to know? Kathleen in Corvallis in the US says, what's the beautiful plant behind you with the blue spire flowers? She says, I know this is not on topic, but it's so unusual. I want to know.
That is a plant made out of paper.
Oh, that's wonderful. Did you make it?
No, a very talented artist in New York made it. Her name is Livia Chetti, and her company is called The Green Vase. And that was an anniversary gift from my husband.
Well, there you are. It's Haley in Asheville says, what dishes did you miss the most from your childhood in Berlin? And if you've had the chance to recreate them, do they taste the same when you're an adult?
Yes. So rote Grütze, for example, was one of those dishes. My mother's very good friends here in Berlin would make that all the time. And when I was a child, I would eat it. And then I moved to the States and I never, ever got a chance to eat it. And it was something I associated so intensely with Berlin. And when I moved back here and started writing that book, I had to ask them for the recipe and test it. And it tasted just as good, good. Yeah.
It's very evocative, the taste of food.
Yeah.
Colin in Colorado says, I want to ask about the difference of breads and methods between New York, Germany and the UK. The rise of the popularity of sourdough. You mentioned sourdough, as more people are turning to eating bread with flavor rather than mass-produced bread.
Yeah. Well, so German sourdough is almost always rye-based. And German breads traditionally are these quite heavy, very, very dark seed heavy breads made with coarsely ground rye berries or coarsely ground spelt or whatever. And I can't really speak to the tradition in the UK. In the US, it seems to me that popular sourdough in the United States comes from the San Francisco tradition, so it's quite light. Usually it's a wheat sourdough and the loaves are sort of lighter and the crumb is fluffier. It's really nice to eat. I don't know, you can make good toasted sandwiches out of it. Whereas German sourdough because it is their evening meal, it's quite sort of heavy and solid, nourishing.
It's Don, again, and this is an interesting one as well from Fort Lauderdale. He said, are there any cheeses that you would recommend trying whilst in Berlin? Maybe to go with some of the breads that we're talking about. Are you into cheeses?
I do. I love cheese. I would say that the best German cheeses probably come from the Alps or the sort of southern Germany. Also the Austrian cheeses, the mountain cheeses. Those are really quite special and relatively easy to find, no matter where you are in Germany.
Yeah, I bet they taste wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely perfect bread. Finally, because although all the questions are still coming in, David, that's right, David in Orlando says, we've talked a lot about the effect, the cultural effect that German food has had, particularly when so many German people went to the States to live. But what about the other way around? What other influences have influenced German baking? I guess with Germany being where it is, it's going to be influenced by absolutely every country around it.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that German baking is pretty solid in its identity. It feels quite immovable in a way, but I think German cooking has been changing a lot, especially over the last, let's say, during the post-war time, the Italian influences, the Turkish influences, and now with so many, Americans have had obviously an interesting history in Germany, because in the post-war, the Americans were the liberators or the conquerors, whatever. But they lived here for so long, and there were so many Americans stationed in Germany. And so there's a real kinship that Germans feel between Americans and themselves. And I think that the influence that American food, I mean, there's the cliches of the hot dogs and the hamburgers. Those are all German foods, right? That came backwards. But I would say now, especially now that there's this whole new generation of Americans coming to Germany, it's really more an open-mindedness and an interest in foods from other places. That's the way I think German cooking has changed the most, is people are starting to realize, like, oh, that, we can take those flavors from there, and this is interesting, and spice is good, and hot peppers can be embraced. And
it's the smells and the spices, I think, that people miss most, I think, when they leave German baking behind. Silly question, but I've always wanted to know, what is a Berliner? Is it a donut?
Yes. So a jelly donut is called a Berliner in a lot of other places in Germany. In Berlin, it's called a Pfannkuchen, which just means pancake, actually. Pancakes have a different name. So the big controversy is, right, whether or not JFK said, I am a jelly donut, right? Yeah. He said, I am a Berliner. Every Berliner knew perfectly well that he was saying, I am standing with you. I'm by your side. He wasn't saying I'm a jelly donut. That's not the case.
Oh, I'm sorry, I had to ask that one.
No, I relish every opportunity to clear up that myth, because I don't want people thinking that Berliners were like, oh, did he just say jelly donut? No.
They knew what he meant.
Exactly. It was a super, a powerful emotional speech.
Oh, it certainly was. It certainly was. Luisa, it's been fabulous talking to you. And I know everybody watching at the moment, we've got more questions coming in, but I don't want to we've talked for ages. Mustn't keep you much longer. But you're writing another book, which we have to watch out for.
Yes, I'm writing another book called Classic German Cooking. And I write a newsletter called Letter from Berlin. You can find it at luisaweiss.substack.com.
Yeah, we've got a button that links everybody to your website.
Yeah, and I'm on Instagram. And if you have any questions, if anybody has questions about German baking or about Berlin or anything, feel free to drop me a line. I love hearing from people.
Absolutely. Clearly you do. And you've got a lot of people wanting to be in touch. Thank you so much for giving us this evening. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely wonderful. And it's thanks to you that my living room now smells of Stollen and Lebkuchen and everything. And it's driving the dog mad, never mind the rest of the family. Thank you so much for joining us, Luisa, and answering those questions. It's been brilliant to talk to you.
Thank you for having me, Anne. It's been lovely.
Good luck with the next book.
Thanks.
Well, there we are. Fantastic, huh? Next week's guest, let me tell you, we're going to be celebrating love on Viking TV. My guest is going to be an author and former editor of Harper's Bazaar. She's Justine Picardy, and she's going to be telling us the the jaw-dropping true story behind her book. The book is called Miss Dior, A Story of Courage and Couture, and you might think it a book about the glitz and glamour of one of the world's most famous fashion houses, but I have to tell you, it is so much more than that. So until next week, do stay safe and well. Enjoy planning your holidays and do a bit of cooking as well in the meantime. Until next week, I'll be with you at the same time, but until next week, stay safe, stay well, and goodbye.